Alrighty, well, good morning, welcome back. Hope everyone had a good weekend. Today we will be discussing cultivated plants and talk a little bit about the naming, classifying, origin of plants, as well as the improvement of germplasm, diversity, and preservation. So to start off, we say today there are likely to be over 500,000 different types of plants on the planet. That's an adjustment from what the book might suggest. And, for all of time, since recorded history, basically, we've been trying to, figure out how to name the organisms around us. And the first recorded names were initially attributed to the Greek philosopher Theophrastus, somewhere kind of 370 to 285 BC. So how do you name a plant? Right? Typically, we name any kind of organism based on maybe how we use it, what its habit is, some other attribute. The problem with that is that when we create names, based on their characteristics that can differ from place to place, then it might not be easy to categorize a species of plant. So we need to develop a system of classifying plants. And basically, we still kind of do it in different ways. Generally, the producers of crops, we might look at them one way as instead of a botanist, for instance, but we have to have some sort of system of classifying, identifying crops, so that we can distinguish what plants we're able to grow in our climate. So looking at plants by climate, of course, we classify them by their cold hardiness zones, where they're able to, at least the perennial plants, where they're able to exist for years upon years. We also look at them in terms of annuals, of their climatic requirements, as whether they are cool hardy or cold hardy or warm season annuals. Generally, if we're looking at things like winter annuals, we look at planting them in the fall and having them bloom maybe later that winter, likely earlier in the following spring. Summer annuals being planted in the spring, blooming through the summer and fall, right? So that's one way to classify them. And the seasons by which, of course, so we look at warm season crops growing best where average temperatures are really above 60. Generally, we plant these early on. Most of our warm season crops are kind of what we think of as our traditional vegetable crops, our corns, beans, squash, tomatoes, peppers, etc. And some of our favorite warm season flowers like petunias, marigolds, and zinnias. Our cool season crops grow best at average temperatures below that, and really more like 50 degrees to 65 degrees. So things like our brassicas, our broccoli, cabbage, kale, collards, cauliflower, peas, some of our flowering bulbous plants like tulips, daffodils, cyclamen. So the thing is, though, is that we classify crops based on really whether they can handle cooler temperatures or not. But then we look at them in terms of the cultivated varieties as the days at which it takes them to mature. So we have early season, mid-season, or late maturing crops. And by using all of these, we can actually kind of extend the growing season and the harvest season so that we can have a product with maximum quality, but also have a sustained source of income. So we also classify plants in accordance to their edible parts. Generally, we look at ornamentals as not being edible, although some of them are. And we think of them more for their aesthetic value. House plants we grow, indoors, and we classify those according to, what their types of foliage, if they flower or not, and what their growth habits are. Foresters look at plants a different way. We're looking at shrubs and trees in this case, and we look at two very broad groups there, the hardwoods and the softwoods. The hardwood types, of course, include those plants that have, hardwood. Things like oaks, maples, birches, beech. Softwood trees are usually the conifers. And they're not always soft. There are some softwood trees that are actually, kind of dense grain, and like cedars, for instance, junipers. But generally, we look at them as being the conifer, the cone-bearing evergreen plants. The hardwoods are usually the broadleaf deciduous types. So for the softwoods, we have things like pine, cedars, redwoods, spruce, fir, etc. And then they also look, of course, at the hardiness zones in which those trees can survive. And we have an interesting part here in being in the mid-Atlantic region, where we have both kind of southern species and northern species kind of meeting, especially here in the mountains. But generally, as you go further north, you have plants that need to be hardier to survive, as you might imagine. So here's just a couple of images of some large softwood trees, which actually, even though they're softwoods, they can still grow to incredible heights and diameters, such as this Jeffrey pine here in the Sierra Nevada, and the coast redwoods over there in Northern California. Some of the tallest trees in the world. But how we really classify plants, we get down to just the simple naming conventions. And most plants we generally know by their common names. Common names being those that are easy to remember, pronounce, and use. And we look at them as how we use them and what their visual characteristics usually are. The only problem, though, is that a common name has value in conversation only if both people know exactly what plant is being discussed. So generally, we have lots and lots of common names for plants that are of the same species, especially if we're in a similar geographic range. So it can be easy to mistake plants. Let's look at jasmine as an example here. And so we have the common name, jasmine, but we actually have many different plants that are called jasmine that may not even resemble one another or be closely related botanically. So our common names have these limitations in the universal written or verbal communication. There's just too many of them, and they're too variable for scientific purposes. So what we use instead is the scientific name using, or a botanical name using this binomial nomenclature, where we have a genus and a species. So we have, as you can see here, two different types of star jasmine, totally different plants, Jasminum gracillumum and Tricholospermum jasminioides. Or down here, we've got two plants that are called night jasmine that are also two totally different species. So Theophrastus, back to him, he was a student of Aristotle, and he classified plants based on their texture and or form. And he began to actually name them, based on these characteristics. The problem with Theophrastus, though, is that he's basically just describing them using Latin words, and ended up with, sometimes 5 or 10 words to describe a single plant. That's a little too difficult. So later on comes along Carl von Linné, aka Linnaeus, a Swiss scientist who devised the modern system of categorizing plants and actually all living organisms. And he did that in kind of the mid 1700s, and we're still using that system today. So it basically groups all living things into different taxa, and taxa are just groups of organisms that are grouped together based on particular physical characteristics, usually based on their reproductive system. So we kind of look at modern day classification as first taxon being domain, which is either prokaryote or eukaryote, whether an organism has is single celled or has multiple cells. And generally we look at dividing that eukaryote domain into the kingdoms of fungi, protists, plants, and animals. And of course, we're dealing mostly with the plant kingdom. I think for the identification of plants, it's very important to know how that kingdom is then further divided up. So we look next at the phylum level, and the most simple plants are algae, and algae are, not very advanced. They don't have a vascular system, and they only exist really in water or very moist environments. We have a step up from algae, and that's the bryophytes, and that includes all of the mosses and liverworts that can exist without being in water all the time, but they reproduce by spores, and they still need a lot of moisture. Then we have the vascular plants, which basically think of the vascular system, that xylem and phloem that's allowing the transport of water and nutrients. It allows plants to get taller. And evolutionarily speaking, we divide them between the seedless plants, those that are breeding through spores, and those that do have seeds. So in the seedless phyla, that includes the pterophytes, which are the ferns. We also have the club mosses, which are a little bit taller, and also the whisk ferns. There's a few other phyla in there of seedless plants that are still reproducing by spores. They're a little bit taller, though. They still require moisture, though, because spores have to be in water in order to actually not germinate, but just be fertilized. Then we have the seeded phyla, which evolutionarily plants developed from spores and from smaller plants into taller plants and then into flowers and seeds. Before we get into the flowering world, though, we get the cycads, the ginkgos, the conifers, which are all kind of simple, non-flowering plants that do have seeds, but don't have them in as advanced enclosures as the flowering plants, the anthophyta or the angiosperms. So after phylum, we then classify them by rank, by the class, order, family, genus, and species. And in between there are a couple of things like superorder or suborder that the botanists use, and I kind of think that's just for job security. They're always reclassifying plants. The idea here, though, is that each descending rank closely defines the characteristics that are common to members of that rank. And Linnaeus did it by the reproductive parts of the plants. So grouping them, especially into the families, by how many flower parts they have, for instance. Today, though, we do it a little bit differently. So let's look at the family level, which the highest taxon that's commonly included in plant identification directly or study. We usually aren't looking as much at the class or order to try to identify plants. We first start at the family level. So Linnaeus had the idea, well, and actually Theophrastus did as well for the most part, but to use it in Latin. And in Linnaeus' time, Latin has already become, a language that was no longer spoken. Of course, it's not spoken today, so the names are going to stay the same, basically. And when it gets to pronouncing the Latin, personally, I don't think it's that important myself. I think as long as you can spell it and pronounce it in a way that helps you to spell it, I don't think it's as big of a deal. Because the true, Italian Latin pronunciation, nobody uses that. So looking at some of the naming conventions here, especially when we get to the genus or species level, we look at some of the names that refer to the leaves, including things like folius or phyllon or phylla. These are usually suffixes found at the end of the words. But we can also have prefixes such as macro or micro, saying big or small leaf. And here's just some examples. Down here at the bottom, alicifolius is like a holly-shaped leaf, or salicifolius, a willow-type leaf, which that first part is referring to the genus of those plants. The Latin for flower is flora, so then we add, a prefix such as grand, which means grandiflora, being large flower. So the southern magnolia, for instance, Magnolia grandiflora, a magnolia with a large flower. We also look at the shapes or growing habits of the plants. So we look at words like altus or alta being tall, arboreus being tree-like, compactus being dense and compact, nanus or pumilus meaning dwarf, repens or reptans being creeping, scandens being climbing. And so you might have a genus of plants, and then these are used as a species to describe that specific genus. We also have names based on the color of either the flower or the foliage. So alba or albus being white, aureus being gold, rubra being red, flavus or luteus being yellow, for example. Also, we look at some species names as defining the plant's place of origin or a person that originally found it. So Australis being southern, Borealis being northern. Campestris, Insularis, and Montanus as being either of the field of an island or on a mountain. Canadensis being from Canada. Virginicus being from Virginia. Chinensis being from parts of Asia, usually from China. And so on and so forth. So each plant name as we have today, the botanical name, is composed of two words. The binomial name. It's in Latin, it's international, and it's understood universally. There's actually a convention on plant naming, basically a group of botanists that get together to, concrete in the names of these plants so that they are universally recognized. Again, botanical and job security. So the first name is the genus, but if we were thinking about it as like people's names, then I think of the genus is more like the last name in a way, because many plants are sharing that. The second is the species, which I think is more like a person's first name. I'm of the Castile family, Ben of the Castile family, right? So, and of course some languages, they use it that way as well. But anyway, We have the genus and the species. The species is the specific epithet that describes that member of the genus. The complete Linnaean names, as they say, have the third element, the authority, which is the abbreviated name of the actual person who named that species of plant. And I don't usually try to even remember that or have my students remember that, so don't worry about the authority. So as I mentioned, we have this international code of botanical nomenclature where these botanists get together and basically look at how these plants are named. Here are the basic rules of that nomenclature. First, the generic name, the genus, always begins with a capital letter. If it is written by hand, we underline it. Typewritten, we italicize it. The species or specific epithet begins with a lowercase letter. Ignore that second part. Don't ever capitalize that. To complete the binomial name, then we also include the authority, but again, I think we can just forget about that as well. Honor the person's memory, but you don't have to write out Linnaeus every time. So whenever we're listing several plants that are in the same genus, we will just abbreviate the genus name just to that first initial capital, and then list the species. So we also do that in scientific papers when we're talking about a genus of plants. So often we'll look at the genus being known, but we don't actually know what the species is. And in those cases, we abbreviate species, either to SP period for a singular unknown species, or SPP for multiple unknown species. However, in that naming convention, we don't actually underline or italicize that. And in some cases, we look at the botanical binomial, as not being sufficient to identify that species, whether it's wild or in cultivation in some cases. So we have subspecific or subspecies categories, such as the botanical variety, a cultivated variety, a group, subspecies. So for example, we've got var, V-A-R period. And that is referring to a botanical variety, found in the wild. So in this case, Buxus microphylla, which is our standard boxwood, of the variety japonica. That would refer to the Japanese small leaf boxwood that is only found in one particular geographic area. For cultivar, we are looking at the cultivated variety. So clones and lines that are not found in the wild, but only found in cultivation. Usually, usually cultivars, cultivated varieties, start as a wild botanical variety and then are propagated clonally, usually, or developed into a line, and then from there, they're only found in cultivation. So we select them for particular characteristics. So the word cultivar, we can either abbreviate as CV, or usually what we do is surround it with a single quotation marks. And it is always capitalized, but it's never underlined or italicized. If there's multiple words in that, we capitalize all of them. So we either use the single quotes or CV, but never both. So the family we look at as a group of closely related genera of plants, or any organism. The relationship is based on, initially in the days of Linnaeus, on the flower structure, the seed structure. But today we're actually looking at the actual genetics of it. We've actually encoded the genome or decoded the genome of many plants. And now we're more able to see how they are more closely related. And so we're grouping families together based on that instead of just how they look. However, I will say that in many cases, the science is proving Linnaeus and his ilk correct, that by defining them based on their flower and seed shapes or reproductive parts, they are actually genetically related very closely. So with family names, we capitalize them. We don't have to underline or italicize them though. They all have this same ending, AC, or if you want to say the Italian Latin, ace, or ACA, however you pronounce it, I don't care. So the nightshade family, for instance, the Solanaceae, includes these genera: Solanum, the potato, capsicum, the pepper. In Solanum, there's also the eggplant. Some botanists also put tomato in there. Other botanists put Lycopersicon as the tomatoes genus. Nicotiana is tobacco. Datura is a deadly nightshade. Petunia, etc. But they're all based on this similar flower structure. And right here we're looking at a potato flower versus a tomato flower. They're nearly identical, except the potato flower is usually white or pink and a little bit larger. Tomato flower is usually yellow. But they have this anther cone. The anthers are surrounding the pistil. Sometimes you can see that the pistil is exerted out from that cone. Either way, it's this like star-shaped flower with 5 petals that are joined together at this corolla. Fascinating. So the AC, when we attach that to the genus's name, that was kind of the standard rule. And now we look at new names being adopted for those families. So, however, you can use either of them at this point. So Asteraceae is now known as the Compositae. Brassicaceae is known as the Cruciferae. Poaceae, the grass family, is Graminae. So on and so forth. You know, and it's good to know them both, I think, because they refer to the flower parts and can help you to identify the members of the family. So Asteraceae, being the composite family, has composite flowers made up of 2 different flower types. The Brassicaceae, you know, I call them the brassicas, you know, the mustards, our cabbage, broccoli, but they're based on the crucifer. They're called crucifers because it has a cross-shaped flower. The Fabaceae, you know, is the legumes. They're nitrogen fixers, so that could be important as well. The Ericaceae is the Palmae family. It's the family of the palms. The Apiaceae is the Umbelliferae, and they all have this like kind of umbrella-shaped flower. So it helps to know them both, and really for our purposes, you can use it. So in identifying plants, we often look at one tool as being a key. And the key is basically looking at characteristics and making a yes or no decision based on the characteristics that are offered, and rejecting those that do not apply. So we call this a dichotomous key. Branches off into 2 choices. To be able to use the keys very well, you often have to know some of the vocabulary, the botanical words of the plant structure. We're going to, it's kind of like choose your own adventure for plants. We're basically going to you know, eliminate the alternative that does not apply. The unfortunate thing about this is that we're looking at multiple characteristics of the plant, and we might not have those all the time, right? So usually at some point you're going to have to look at the flower of the plant. If you don't have, if the plant's not blooming, then you might not be able to identify it using the dichotomous key in that period of time. So basically, you're just narrowing it down until you get to the final choice of the species. And we've got a book, The Flora of Virginia, which basically a group of botanists and taxonomists got together, and they looked at every single species that grows wild in Virginia, whether it's native or non-native, and they classified it based on this and turned it into this dichotomous key that is over 1,000 pages long. The cool part, though, is that you can also get that as an app on your phone. So check that out if you're interested in identifying plants in the wild. It's called the Flora of Virginia app. It costs $10 or something, but it goes to a good cause. So as I mentioned, certain plant parts might not be available during particular seasons. So it might be necessary to come back to that plant later on, or in some cases, maybe even wait till a fruit or seed develops. Generally, though, those families are grouped together based on, first, those flower and seed shapes. Here's just an example of a dichotomous key, and it's in the entire tables there in your textbook, page 203, 204. And as you can see, there are some, like if we look at one, the ovules and seeds are born naked on scales in cones without typical flowers. Or plants with seeds are born in an ovary with typical flowers. So that's the difference between the gymnosperms, the conifers, or the angiosperms, the flowering plants. One has cones instead of flowers, the other one has typical flowers. And then, as you can see here, the gymnosperms, there are less species of them, so they're a little bit easier to identify down to the family level. The flowering plants take a little bit longer and a little bit more botanical knowledge. Some of these plants are kind of hard to classify, though. Didn't prevent them from classifying them, but I think of these as like evolutionary steps. So, for instance, in this cycad, we've got a cluster or an inflorescence of flowers, and also this pinnate foliage that makes it look a little bit more like a palm, but it's actually a cycad, botanically and genetically. Over here on the right, we've got the yew, Taxus baccata, and in this case, it's not really a cone. It's a fleshy covering of that fruit that does not actually enclose the plant all the way, or the seed all the way. So it's still a naked seed. Gymnosperm literally means naked seed. And so they're still classifying it as a gymnosperm, even though it started to develop more of a fleshy covering instead of a cone. It's kind of neat. So here's cottonflower, which is a flowering plant, but it kind of looks like a very simple flower, and it doesn't look like the regular flower that we think of. Strawberry flower here could be difficult to classify because it's got a different type of seed shape and flower shape, and a different type of fruit than anything else that is in that rose family. However, because of that flower shape and genetics, they do keep it in the rose family. So in terms of the cultivated plants and crops, we kind of mentioned this on several occasions here, but early on, before written history, we changed our way of interacting with the land, from being hunters and gatherers to actually settling down and developing agriculture. And we started to cultivate plants. These ancestors, made these selections of our modern food plants based on really what we think are just some mutations. But very early, we're just looking at it as using those plants for food and fiber and shelter, maybe medicine, as we started to develop and realize that we could do that. But it wasn't until much, much later that, we became concerned about using plants for aesthetic quality, using them for things like landscaping. So since then, we really added so much to the list of cultivated plants because we're looking at characteristics based on just the way they look instead of how we use them. And there was a Swiss botanist here, Alphonse de Candolle, who wrote The Origin of Cultivated Plants, and basically was the first one to really talk about how the first humans observed these mutations and tried to develop crops out of them, or did develop crops out of them, I should say. And then we have our Nikolai Vavilov, who we talked about on several occasions, who actually studied the origins, the centers of the diversity and the origins of plants in Russia. But that wasn't until the 50s that he developed his theory on the origination of plants in the 8 independent centers. And we've already kind of looked at these, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But again, here's this image again, where these plants came from, and from those 8 original centers, other botanists developed many more of them, looking at where these plants came from. Some of it's pretty surprising. Like, did you know that the apple actually originated in Kazakhstan, or what is modern day Kazakhstan? Or that sweet potatoes, okra, came from Africa? Interesting stuff. So we've talked about actually preserving, cultivating those plants using vegetative and asexual propagation methods last week. And we mentioned how some of the oldest cultivated woody plants are still in existence, and they're still basically just clones of each other. And it's, I think, a fortunate thing that those plants just happen to be easy to cultivate. So by hardwood cuttings. I have to give credit to that first person who thought, well, hey, if I cut this off the plant and I stick it in the soil, maybe it'll grow. They figured it out, and it worked. So grapes, figs, olives, these very early cultivated plants are still easy to propagate using these vegetative methods. As we developed kind of globalized trade, we moved these plants all around the world. And as we did that, we developed not just the asexual propagation, but also some sexual propagation too. In some cases, maybe we have wild relatives in multiple places. For instance, with the apple, it came from Kazakhstan, but we had members of the Malus apple genus that were wild here in North America. And it's believed that they, like the crab apples, that they cross-pollinated these that they brought over from Europe, which gave rise to an edible apple, an edible fruit. So, whereas early on, we were just using them to make cider from. So we believe that the domestication of the seed-propagated plants began with the purposeful harvesting of grains, wild grass seeds, some of which were then planted again for the next year's crop. And we look at this in the cereals and the grains as a mutation of the shattering gene. And basically, most of the seeds on the wild plant version will shatter, or just when they're ripe, they just fall to the ground on their own. Because as you can imagine, the plant just wants to reproduce and grow more plants. So it wants to disseminate as many of its seeds as possible. The non-shattering seeds, though, those that stayed on the plant, were harvested and then could be resown. So that mutation of the wild grains, basically to hold on to those seeds, is I mean, logically, the first step in the cultivation of grains. If we plant, and this is kind of the basis of, crop-based agriculture, if we're planting harvested seeds in a close together in a cultivated plot where we keep the weeds down, then we're automatically going to be selecting for stronger and more vigorous plants. So as we do that over and over, and we're saving the seeds from the best, we are actually kind of, in a way, participating in the evolution or the cultivation of those plants. So some of the characteristics that we're looking at in the sexual propagation, it's selecting as we're saving the seeds from these plants, are things such as the loss of seed dormancy, the ability for them to grow from that seed very easily without having to go through stratification or scarification. We also look at increased flower numbers, because more flowers means more fruits and larger flowers. A lot of the characteristics for selection tend towards more determinate growth, so more of the things on that plant are ripening around the same time. We also look at the present improved cultivated varieties as being adapted to our cultural practices, so much to the point where they completely depend on our care for their existence. Like modern corn, for instance, Zea maize. Maize, basically, if you think about it, it's wrapped so tightly in this cob that if that cob were just to fall to the ground, the seed's not able to plant itself and regrow. We might occasionally have 1 or 2 kernels grow into a plant, but generally we have to shill that corn off of that cob and replant it in order for it to be able to grow. So we are involved in the preservation of that crop. So looking at some of the early ones here, wheat, which is the most widely cultivated plant in the world today, and what we think was the first, or one of the first plants to be cultivated, because it's used worldwide for making bread. And it evolved from the wild wheat-like grass that is found and cultivated in the Near East, somewhere around 10 to 14,000 years ago. And we believe that it was improved probably likely from spontaneous hybridization. So 2 different species, this Triticum aestivum and Triticum turgidum, were likely to have crossed through, just cross-pollination. Wind carried that pollen over, it fertilized them, it created a hybrid variety. The chromosomes doubled, and then the mutations and caused it to increase fertility and you lose that shattering characteristic. So those grains were held on the plant. So we noted last week that the species that we've cultivated occur in a series that have increasing chromosome numbers. These increasing chromosomes lead to greater diversity of the characteristics. So we have plant breeders that have intentionally developed different forms of these crops, such as dwarf forms of wheat, which can produce higher yields without falling over or lodging. Also from the Near East, we have early wheat forms taken into places such as Egypt, the Balkans, and Central Europe, where there were different wild ancestors. So they cross, and then those, arise new characteristics. And then it eventually gets taken all over the world. The Spanish actually brought wheat to the Americas. So we'll end off there with our conversation on wheat, triticum. Anybody have any questions or concerns? All right, well, I'm almost through with grading the midterm exam, so I'll have those graded, and we'll talk about that a little bit on Wednesday, and we'll finish this chapter in the book. Otherwise, you all have a great day.
Okay, you too. Is Hunter there?
Hunter is right here.
Okay. Hi, Hunter. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good.
Fantastic. Okay. Call you back in a couple minutes.
All right, we'll see you soon.
Bye.